But I want to make sure that we have ample time for our keynote speaker. He is someone that I've known for many years in local government, as someone who also thinks that I'm funnier than I am and loves dry sense of humor. Wilf has a lot of great anecdotes and stories and a lot of professional experience to share with us. So I think it's a bit of a coup that we got him up here tonight to be our opening speaker to the Cash Summit. So with that, I just want to say thank you to everyone that's here this evening. I'll say again the same tomorrow. So if you hear this in the morning, you'll know it's for a slightly different mix of folks that are expected to be in tomorrow's general sessions and breakouts. But welcome to the 11th annual Cash Summit. This year, we've blended in more economic development than in years past. We have some exciting things already in the works for next year. So we look forward to your feedback that'll come tomorrow afternoon if you are with us throughout that day. By tomorrow's afternoon breakout sessions, we'll be asking for your feedback to make sure that we incorporate more of what you want and need for your communities or businesses next year at our summit. So without further ado, my name is Sean Milne, by the way. I work for the Bear River Association of Governments. I'm the Director of Community and Economic Development. I want to give a shout out to other members here from Bragg. For those that are here from Bragg, would you please raise your hand? I know I've got our Executive Director, Lucas Martin, over here. Brandon Bell is our lead regional planner. We have Russ Price with the Community Advisor Program, and Paul Davis has just re-entered the room. He's also on our team. Cindy, who's walking in at the back, was part of our planning committee, and Karina Brown up here in the front. Anyone else? Steve with the planning committee as well. And Vicki Fenton with Badger Screen Printing these days, but many of us know her from her extensive career with the Department of Workforce Services. And then, of course, we have some other team members that are here this evening with us, Dirk Anderson and Emma George on our team. Who am I forgetting? Anyone? I think that's everyone with our planning committee. So if you don't mind, if you'd please help me give them a round of applause for their work in helping. Thank you. There's a lot of work, and I know many of you in the room, so I know you know there's a lot of work that goes into planning an event, even if it seems like it's a short event. There's a lot of planning that goes on in the background. So thank you. I appreciate all of those individuals. I'd also be remiss if I didn't give a hat tip to a gentleman that's sitting up here in front. His name is Brian Carver, and he worked for Bragg for a long time in the role that I'm now find myself in. And so I just want to give him a quick shout out, Brian Carver with Bear River Association of Governments for 17 years and is now with JUB. Which reminds me, we really appreciate our sponsors. So from the Cache Valley Association of Realtors, where are they at? They've moved. Okay, over here. Thank you very much. We really appreciate the association and UPR for their help getting the word out, and Mountain America Credit Union, JUB, Y-Fiber, and a number of them that you see at that trifold that's in the middle of our tables. All right. Without further ado, Mr. Sommerkorn, would you come on up? Grace us with your wisdom and your humor. We look forward to learning more about the good, bad, and ugly of our group decisions. Welcome. Let's see.
Yeah, I've known Sean for a long time. Yeah, I remember his first involvement in government, which I think was in Tooele, wasn't it? And I think he really got a lesson there when he was about how politics works. But my name is Wilf Sommerkorn, as was already stated. But I am formally retired. About a 40-year career in planning and land use. 27 years I was at Davis County, 14 of which I was a director of Davis County Community and Economic Development. Then 6 years as the Salt Lake City planning director, and 5 years as Salt Lake County regional planning and transportation director. And so I've kind of been involved in this for a while and gotten to learn things. In the meantime, my wife, when she retired, she taught math, everybody's favorite subject. She taught math in high school. When she retired, she said, I'm retiring now and I'm going traveling. You coming with me? And I said, I guess I better. So I retired as well. And boy, has she kept us hopping. I just got back a few weeks ago from a 2-week trip to China. Prior to that, we were in Croatia, Slovenia, Montenegro. Prior to that, we were in the Galapagos Islands. And we've been a lot of places. And I keep doing stuff like this. And my wife keeps saying, why you're retired? Why do you keep doing this? And I just kind of, I don't know, kind of have it in my blood. I enjoy it. And I think there's a lot of benefit to it. So having done this for as long as I did, and in all of those years, I can't even tell you how many planning commission meetings, city council meetings, county commission meetings, just tons of meetings like that that I've been to in my life, a lot. And I got to see a lot of things and got to kind of wonder about some things like, why do they make the decisions that they make? How does this work? Why do they sometimes make these really stupid decisions? Or conversely, wow, I'm really surprised they made some really good decisions. And it just got me to thinking a little bit about the whole dynamics as I continued to work with bodies like that, thinking, well, let's try to see if we can figure this out. And so I actually began to do a little bit of research. I thought I'm gonna figure out how these small groups, planning commissions, councils, other small bodies like this, how they get around to making their decisions. And so I have to give credit where credit is due. As I was reading up on this and trying to figure it out, these 3 books. At this point, I'm not getting oh, there we go. Got it. Thank you, Dan. It's all right. These 3 books are really the main sources where I get a lot of the information that I'm going to be talking about tonight, that really reflect and gave some background and meaning to what I kind of perceived and then continued to observe as I worked with these various bodies. How many of you are on a planning commission? Okay, a good bunch of you. How many of you are elected official? Another good bunch. So, and any of you are, I mean, probably others of you work with small groups and try to make decisions and move things forward. There's a lot of interesting things that happen in these small groups and how they make decisions. So let's talk about this a little bit. And we'll start with, I want to tell you a story about a guy by the name of Francis Galton. This is back in 1906. At this point in time, Francis Galton had established a pretty good reputation for himself as a statistician and a person who knew a lot about the science of heredity. He did a lot of work, a lot of the initial foundational work in the science of heredity. At this point, he was 85 years old. But he had an idea, he had a thought, and he wanted to prove it. And he wanted to prove it using his statistical methods. Galton thought that democracy was a sham. He pretty much figured that giving people the vote, letting them go out and vote on all kinds of issues, people that are involved in various issues, the average person, he thought, knows very little about these issues. They don't know much at all. So how in the world are they going to make wise decisions, good decisions on the political issues of the day that people are asked to vote on or to vote candidates on who will be dealing with those issues? And he figured, I think it's not a good system of government. It doesn't work well. It's not governing well. And I'm going to go out and prove it. And the way he was going to prove it was he was going to go around that year to a number of common features that existed all over the English countryside at that time. The English country fair. Nearly every country fair in those days had a contest where they would have an ox or livestock, cattle there, and they would ask people to guess the weight of it. People would purchase a ticket. They would write their guess for the weight of that ox or that cow or whatever it was there on there, put it in a box, and then at the end, the person who came the closest to the weight would win some prizes. And it was a common feature, a popular feature, something that people did a lot. Dalton talked to the organizers of these contests and made an arrangement with them that after the contest, they would give him all of the tickets, and he was going to run statistical work analysis on these tickets and figure out. And basically, he was going to prove that people were not very good as a whole in deciding what the weight, and thereby proving that people on average aren't going to make good decisions on a whole variety of issues. So he figured that the crowd, the group of people, was capable of very little. And that, of course, is the basis for democracy, is taking the vote of a lot of people. So he gathered the tickets from the first event after it was over. He performed a number of statistical tests on those tickets, see if they formed a bell curve for one thing, and the average. And the range of guesses he found was quite broad. He figured that, there were going to be a few people that knew something about cattle that would be making guesses. You would probably have some farmers, people that had cattle that would have an idea, probably some butchers and so on, that they might have a good idea. But those would be very few people compared to the number of people that would be providing guesses. So he figured overall the results would not be very good. He got a big surprise. The weight in Plymouth, where he did this first one in the city of Plymouth, the weight of the ox at the fair that day was 1,198 pounds. That was the actual weight. When he got averaged all of the tickets that had been submitted that day, the average came to 1,197 pounds. It was within 1 pound of the actual weight of the ox that was on display that day. Fluke, he thought. That's just a fluke. So he went around to a number of country fairs that year around England and performed the same thing. And you know what? It came out about the same way almost every time. Really surprised him. Let's talk about another example. This is from the book, one of those books that I showed you right at the beginning, Len Fisher's book, The Perfect Swarm. What Len Fisher did was he took a jar full of jelly beans and he went into the pubs around London and around in England, and he asked people in the pub to guess the beans. How many jelly beans did he have in his jar? Just as an example of one of them, the range that he got was 41 to 93. Pretty broad range. The average of all the guesses that he got was 60. The number of jelly beans in the jar was 61. There's way more than 61. Yeah, this one is not the same jar that he took. I just put this up here as a representation. But the jar that he had 61 in it, and almost every time, once again, much like Dalton's experience with the country fairs, people would get very close to the actual number of beans when he averaged all of the guesses that were made by people in the pub. Another example from another book, the Columbia Business School. Business class there, the instructor in the class for a year at the time of the Academy Awards would have, he had one of these big classes, right? Where the tiers and the levels up there and a number of students. He would have his classes pick who the winners would be in the 12 various categories of the Academy Awards every year. The best any individual student got right during the time that he did this was 5. Some student got 5 of the winners of the categories right. When he averaged, or when he looked at what all of his students, all of his classes guessed and averaged them out, they were correct on average in 11 out of 12 categories. Rather remarkable. This is kind of what we call, and what is called, the wisdom of crowds. Research has shown that this kind of result holds true pretty generally, as long as there are 3 conditions that exist. There really need to be three conditions to make this work and hold. And so let's talk about what those three conditions are. The first one is diversity. Numerous studies, and these books that I showed you again at the beginning, they cite a lot of studies that have been done through social science, social research. Numerous studies have shown that having a wide diversity of people in a group makes the group smarter, more likely to come up with the good or the right answer than groups that are more uniform. Uniform groups do not generally, because people in the group tend to all think alike, and they don't get perhaps the nuance and the variance that may occur in real world. And so they oftentimes don't get as good or as right of an answer as a broadly diverse group does. In Galton's experiment in the country fairs, he would have a few people, the farmers and the butchers, that were smart, but a lot of the other people had really no idea about cattle. And so they didn't have a real basis on which to base their guesses. But having everyone be an expert is not necessarily the better way to go, because once again, the research showed that groups that were diverse made better decisions than groups that were uniform, even if those uniform groups were made up of experts, entirely of experts in that given field or that given area. I mean, that kind of goes against, logical thought, doesn't it? And yet that's what the research showed. So we'll talk about that here in just a little bit more detail. The second condition that needs to exist is that individuals need to make their decisions independently. That is, it has to be their idea, not somebody else's idea. They need to be the ones saying, well, this is what I think, not, well, I heard, mom or dad say that this might be, so I'll say what mom or dad says or whatever. No, it needs to be the individual. In those English country fairs, when people bought that ticket, generally they would take that ticket because everybody else in their group was buying a ticket as well. And so they didn't want to, give it away. So they'd take that ticket and fill it out on their own, what they thought. So it was their own thought, not anybody else's. The third condition that needs to exist is how you aggregate those decision points, how you collect all of that information, all from the individuals, and how you put it together. That's really another critical thing. And really what that means is how people express that choice, that judgment is what matters. And the best way to do that is anonymously. And we'll talk about why that is here in a little bit. But in the English country fairs, again, person bought that ticket, they filled out the number, they didn't show it to anybody else because they didn't want anybody else to, take their guess or think maybe they were really stupid for what they were guessing. And they would just fill it out and they drop it in the box. Nobody knew what they were guessing. All right. That seems to hold true for large groups, large bodies of individuals, and you really kind of seem to get that wisdom of crowds effect when we do that in large groups. Well, as I mentioned, I had been dealing with planning commissions. How many members of a planning commission? 7, maybe, sometimes 5, maybe as many as 9. Councils are generally 5, 6, 7 people. Other bodies are really not much bigger than that. So it's not a lot of people. So, we do that business. The kind of business that we're looking at is in small groups. Do these principles hold true? Do they work in small groups as well? Well, let's take a look at them and we'll see what the research showed and what we can learn from that. First one, diversity. Again, and when we're talking about diversity, what we're talking about here is a diversity of background, of age, of experience, of gender. It's important in small groups as well as large groups. That's what the research shows. Numerous studies show that groups made up of diverse members do better, once again, even in small groups, than those made up of uniform members. One really interesting study was so there was a series of problems, set of problems that people were going to be asked to solve. And the researchers in this case would ask people to volunteer and they'd be part of the study, and they gave them these problems to solve. And then based on that, some people were good at it, some people weren't so good at it. And so they kind of had everybody kind of categorized. These people are good, these people are okay, these people are not so good at it. Then they started putting people together in groups to work on the problems collectively and solve those problems. Another set of problems that were a little bit more complex, and work them in groups. The interesting thing that they found was groups that were made up almost entirely of not good problem solvers didn't do well. No surprise, right? The groups that were made up of all good problem solvers, they did pretty well. Again, not a big surprise. The groups that did the very best were ones that had people that were randomly selected on them that had some good solvers and some not so good solvers. And those groups did the best of all. Why would that be? You know, it's really kind of something that you think about. It makes you think a little bit why that would be. Um, it's when you read through the research and read through the conclusions, what it really turns out to be is that the conclusion is that it's good to have people with different kinds of backgrounds, different kinds of experience, and different abilities in a group, because sometimes you get thrown curves in problems, or things will happen in problems, or there may be things that you need to look at in a problem that not everybody would think the same way about. And maybe you get a little bit of a different perspective or a little bit of a different idea from it based on who's in that group. And so that kind of seems to be what makes it work. I mean, everybody always thinks, make up your group of the experts, then you're going to get the best possible answer. One of the books, again, has a lot of research on this and shows that for a broad variety of fields, groups that are made up entirely of experts in a given field, they are competent to a level and are pretty good at what they're doing, but only to a level. Beyond that level, they really don't do any better than groups that are made up of people that include those who are not experts in that area, which is really an interesting result. Bottom line is, beyond a fairly low level of competence, those experts really don't seem to make much of a difference. A diversity of backgrounds actually works much better. It's good to have an expert or two in the group. That seems to be something that is beneficial, but it shouldn't all be experts. Here's a good example. How many of you remember the old show, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? You remember that, and people were answering questions, and when they got stuck on a question for a result, trying to guess what the right answer is, they could do a couple of different things. One was to call a friend, somebody that they think would be an expert. One was I forget what one, the other one was to ask the audience, right? Poll the audience, see what the audience as a group says. Those first two, call your friend who supposedly you think is going to be an expert on this, or ask the audience, who do you think did better? Ask the audience by quite a bit. Over the history of the show, the audience got the right answer 90% of the time. The friend who was supposedly an expert got the right answer 60% of the time. So interesting results. Here's another really interesting example. And again, there's a lot of discussion about this in one of the books, which I found absolutely fascinating. Think about the NASA engineers. All right. This group of NASA engineers, people who were kind of tasked early in the 1960s with the job of getting manned landing on the moon by the end of the decade. That was their task. That was their charge. They did it. They pulled it off. It was quite remarkable and quite amazing that they did that. they were all pretty much engineers. And they did it. They pulled it off. But you know, we say engineers, but in those days, there wasn't really any such a thing as an aeronautical engineer or a space engineer. These guys, they were civil engineers, mechanical engineers, structural engineers, chemical engineers, all kinds of a diversity of types of engineers. And they really pulled it off. They pulled off a remarkable feat by taking less than 10 years to develop and produce and do all of that stuff and get people to the moon. They really pulled it off. Now, the book also then covers another thing that happened, the shuttle disaster, the first big shuttle disaster. There have been a couple. There was a lot of soul searching and research that went into why did this shuttle disaster happen? And one of the main conclusions, after a lot of work, a lot of effort, a lot of study into this, one of the main conclusions in this was, first of all, let me go back and show you this picture. You see all those engineers there in the old NASA photo? I just told you they were really diverse. Do they look very diverse? They don't. They all have those crew cuts, haircuts, you know, they have white shirts, they have those string ties. They all wore that, but they were all quite diverse in what their backgrounds were. Take a look at these guys. They look pretty diverse, don't they? The engineers that were around at the time of the shuttle disaster. But you know what? They were not very diverse. By this point in time, there had been established at a couple of major universities around the country aeronautical engineering programs. And if you really wanted to have a good chance of getting a job at NASA, you had a degree from one of those programs. And there were only a couple or only a few programs. What that meant was, and what the conclusion of the research into the disaster was, that these engineers thought too much alike. They all kind of had the same background, the same experience, the same information, and they tended to treat things the same way. And, you know, you might remember that we had an engineer here in Utah that really tried to blow the whistle on that. Remember that? He was saying it's getting too cold. Those O-rings won't do well. They won't function well in the cold. He was not an engineer that was one of the pack. And, you know, he turned out to be absolutely right, but he wasn't listened to. And so it kind of just shows, again, the benefit of having a diverse group. Now, what does a diverse group mean sometimes? Well, all right, you're on your plan, you're in a planning commission or on a council, you're in your meeting, it's 11 o'clock at night. You've got maybe one or two items of business left. Everybody's tired. You've been there a long time. Here's this one item. Let's just get it over with, right? Let's deal with it. All right, here we are. Let's make a motion. Let's get out of here. And then one of the members of your group goes, yeah, but I don't see it that way. And everybody else goes, oh. In a way, I mean, you can call that dissent. All right. Does dissent play a useful role? It absolutely does. It is, again, it often comes about because of diversity, because people who think of things a little bit differently than maybe everybody else does on the group. The value in dissent is there are a number of values in dissent. One of them is to overcome the pressure to voice an opinion that may be different. How many of times, those of you who are on a commission or on a council, how many times have you been in a meeting in the evening and somebody says, you know, let's do this, and you sit there and you go, oh, I don't know that I agree with that. But then you go, yeah, I'm not going to raise a ruckus over it. Let's just go, you know, I don't want to make a fuss over this. Well, when somebody is willing to say, I don't think I agree with that. Now other people go, yeah, well, I don't think I really agreed with that either. And now maybe it's kind of opened the door for people to say things that they had been thinking that they maybe weren't willing to talk about before. A dissenter may also bring forward information that others in the group don't have. That's one of the values in having somebody say, yeah, well, I see something different. I know something different. At the very least, it may cause the other members of the group to examine their own positions more closely and decide, am I really right on this? Am I thinking right on this? And you may conclude that you are, and that's fine, and that's great. And the benefit of it is you thought a little bit more deeply about it. And now maybe you're a little bit more confident in the direction that you want to head. Again, an interesting study. So back in the, I don't know when this was, probably in the 70s, something like that, and there was a popular thing going that was called investment clubs. These were groups of people that would get together and they would look at where to invest money, usually in the stock market, but they might do other things too, commodities or whatever. But these investment clubs would get together and they would decide. Somebody went out and got a hold of a number of these investment clubs and kind of observed them and take a look at how they did things. And he found an interesting thing. What he found was that investment clubs, the groups where people disagreed with each other, oftentimes more vocally and more forcefully than other groups that maybe where they all were just like, yeah, okay, yeah, it's fine. We'll all do that. Everybody just agreed. The groups that had more disagreement, more debate, more chattering about whether this was a good idea or not, rather than the groups that just kind of were like, yeah, one person says this is what we should do. Yeah, well, we're all going to do it. Those disagreeing groups did better in their investments. So that's just kind of I think, an indication of the value that comes from having those that will bring something forward. Dissent in and of itself is not necessarily a virtue, but it's not a bad thing either if it's done in the correct way. What you don't want is you don't want this guy, right? You all familiar with him? The guy who disagrees with everything. He doesn't like anything that the group is doing, and he's vocal about it. He really lets you know, and sometimes it becomes really almost insulting about it. This guy is not of value because of his behavior, because of the way he treats other people, because of the way he always disagrees with everything. What happens with the rest of the group? Pretty soon you ignore this guy, right? Oh, that's just Fred disagreeing again. We don't think he has a good reason. That's just what he likes to do. He just likes to disagree about everything. Well, so if you have some thought, some idea, something that you feel like that maybe it warrants a different look at things, you got to be careful on how you do that, on how you bring that out. What you don't want to do is you don't want to alienate the group by your behavior and by the rudeness, the antisocial behavior, the other things that sometimes come from these contrarians. All right. Now, a single dissenter can make a difference. That's what's interesting. A number of these studies also found is that a single dissenter can make a difference in a group. How many of you are familiar with the play and the movie 12 Angry Men? All right. The movie, Henry Fonda was the guy, the one guy in a jury where everybody in the jury, they were like, yeah, all right, I've got a baseball game I need to go to. I'm tired. I don't want to deal with this. Yeah, the guy's obviously guilty. Let's just all agree to this and get out of here. And everybody was ready to just nail this guy and call him guilty and go home and be done with it. And one guy in the group said, well, wait a minute. What about this? And what about that? And he kind of brought up things that he had observed, that he was aware of, and that others maybe were aware of as well, but they were not necessarily willing to accept it or to deal with it. And over a period of time in this movie, in this play, he winds up turning around the jury by bringing up this information. I don't know how realistic that scenario is, especially for something like a jury dealing with like a murder case. But I have seen it work in other instances on my own. For example, when I was planning director in Salt Lake City, we had a provision in our code. We had some developer who wanted to build a small cul-de-sac and do a hammerhead in there, and then allow, which would mean that vehicles could go in, but then they couldn't just turn around. They would have to back at some point in that hammerhead kind of a configuration, kind of a T shape, and then come back out. A lot of people didn't like that because they just felt like it wasn't a good idea to have vehicles backing out. And so they had a lot of reasons why the code would allow for it. The Salt Lake City code at the time would allow for it, but it had to be approved by the planning commission in a review of the design. When it was initially proposed, most of the planning commission members were all like, nah, that's not a good idea. They don't want to see that. You have the mail truck that's going to go in there, and and that's just a mess for the mail truck to have to turn around. You have the fire engines if there's a fire or something in there, and they might go in there, and then if they go in the wrong way, then they need to turn around, and they're not going to be able to do that very fast. And there's just a lot of reasons why they didn't think it was a good idea. And then one of the planning commission members said, my daughter in Arizona lives on a cul-de-sac like this, and it actually seems to work pretty well. They seem to like it a lot. It certainly cuts down on the traffic. And the mailboxes, for example, they took all of the mailboxes and they put them out in a group at the entrance to the cul-de-sac. And the fire department was not necessarily opposed to it because they felt like if they ever needed to go up in there, then they would be there for a reason, and it wouldn't be a problem. And it hasn't turned out to be a problem. And the people who lived there seemed to think this was a good idea. They liked it the way it was. That one planning commissioner said that, and I watched all of the other planning commissioners start to turn around. Oh, well, if it works somewhere, well, then why not? And in the end, they wound up approving it. But when they started that discussion, I thought for sure they were not going to approve it, just the comments that were coming. But we had one commissioner who had a different experience or knew of a different experience and brought that forward and turned the rest of them around and really made that decision come out differently. So it really does seem to be something that can work. And again, this happens because you have a diverse group, people who think differently and look at things a little bit differently. All right, let's talk about one of the second condition, which is making your conclusions independently. That's an important factor. Len Fisher, again, he goes into a pub with a jar of jelly beans once again. And this time he asks not individual people, but he goes to tables in the pub. And he says, I want your table to give me an estimate, a guess of how many jelly beans are in this jar. And he would do that, but get it from a table, which meant the table had to talk and they had to decide as a group. The range this time was much smaller. And the number, first of all, let me tell you, the number of jelly beans in this jar was 147. Okay, 147. The range was much smaller this time. He got 97 to 152. That was the range that he got. The average of all the guesses was 105. The actual number was 147. It wasn't that close. It was a lot worse than when individuals on their own were making the guess. What happened? Why was it different? Why was it so much worse? Did the group discussing it make the group dumber? Is that what happened? In our meetings, in our groups meetings of small group meetings, don't we encourage discussion? Don't we want people to talk about the various things that options and ideas and things and so on, so that we can get various ideas out there? Probably, but I think one of the things we need to do is we need to be aware of a number of things that go on in discussions, especially in small groups, and how they can affect the discussion. Let me run through some of them really quickly here because we want to make sure we get out of here by 7 o'clock so you can get to the breakout sessions. The first one is called cascades. This is what happens in a group when one person says something. Yeah, you start a discussion, the first person says something. Pretty soon, everybody in the group is kind of following along with what that first person said. Doesn't always happen, but it happens a lot. Um, it's it's a kind of thing which it's kind of interesting. Again, what the studies showed was that group decisions, more often than not, turn out to be what the first speaker says. And a lot of that is because after that first speaker says something, everybody else, not everybody, not all the time, but often enough, other people in the group go, yeah, okay, I'll go along with that. Why do they do that? Why do groups do that? One is uncertainty. The others in the group, they're like, gee, I don't know. I'm not sure what to think about this. And then when that first person says, this is what I think, then you go, oh, yeah, okay, that sounds good to me. I'll go along with that. Another reason is social. When that first speaker says something, you you find yourself thinking, well, gee, that person must know what they're talking about. I'm not sure I agree with them, but I'm not going to buck them. I'm going to go along. They may know more than I do anyway, so I'm just going to go along with what they have to say, even though I'm not sure I really agree with it. And that happens more often than not. And then there's oftentimes the pressure to conform. Once you have that first speaker that says something, and then another person agrees with them, and then another person agrees with them, and you're sitting there going, hey, geez, I don't agree with this. But at the end, you're going, well, if I don't agree with it, everybody's going to be mad at me. So I'll just go along with the group. Happens more often than you think. So that's something to really be aware of in a group discussion. Now, here's something to be aware of as well. The role of staff. Staff are early speakers. They usually make a presentation to your body. Does that matter? It depends. Many of you have probably been around and learned enough to know that a planning commission, sometimes the councils, but more often the planning commission makes two different kinds of decisions, administrative and legislative decisions. The administrative decisions are supposed to be, do they follow our rules? Is there evidence that is all of the information that's presented showing that they're conforming to our rules? The other one, legislative, is much more opinion based. Is it a good idea to rezone the property, to change our general plan? That's much more of a, is this a good idea or not? Staff in the administrative type of decision, their role is generally to give you information. And that's probably a good thing that helps a lot in making that decision. But in the legislative realm of things, you got to be wary, you got to be careful, and the staff needs to be careful not to present the information that they do. Like, is this a rezone a good idea or not? Is it a good idea to change our general plan for the community or not? That it's not based, they have an opinion. Are they giving you their opinion, or what are they giving you? And what makes their opinion more valid than your opinion? And so you kind of have to be careful of that to decide what the role there is. But again, it all goes about the early speakers. Now, talking about speakers, we oftentimes have public hearings, venues at which people can come in and have their say. Does that influence your thinking? Should it influence your thinking? Once again, it kind of goes to that administrative, legislative role. Many of us who are involved in land use as a profession or have done this for a lot of years, we generally discourage you from having public hearings for administrative issues. And that's things like approving a subdivision plat, approving a conditional use permit, approving various kinds of things where somebody's applying under your code or ordinance and you're checking to see if they comply with your code or ordinance. The reason is when people come and speak at those kinds of meetings, or really at any meeting, what are people giving you? Are they giving you facts or opinion? More often opinion. In an administrative setting, opinion is not a valid basis for making a decision. And so in that regard, it can actually be a disadvantage. And it's a disadvantage not only because you're not going to get any good information that you need to make a decision, but it can also make people think they're having a role in helping you make that decision. And then when you don't listen to them, or they say you're not listening to them, then they get mad at you. And they get mad oh, what the heck? What's the benefit of this government? They never listen to us anyway. So there's a lot of disadvantages to having public hearings. But in the in the legislative role, when it's more about is this a good idea or not, boy, that's great. That's maybe something beneficial to hear the ideas and the thoughts of others. So, and it also sometimes makes a difference when you have those hearings. Who comes to those hearings? Do people usually come to hearings that are in favor of something? Not usually. Sometimes, but not usually. You usually just get the folks who are against something that come to it, right? How many other people are out there that either are fine with it or don't care? But the people that are at your meeting, you tend to think, well, they're representative of everybody else in the community. They are probably not representative of everybody else in the community. So it's really something that you need to be aware of as you consider and think about what that discussion is doing to your thinking. And I'll give you an idea on what we can do about that. Another form of cascading is sequential voting. That's the idea where I'm still trying to get I'm on a planning commission in the town where I live. I'm on the planning commission. I have tried for a long time to get them to stop sequential voting. And sequential voting is where you go, it's basically like a roll call vote, right? Such and such, such and such, such, and each one votes individually. The disadvantage of doing that is, once again, the people who vote early on tend to influence those who are voting later for all of the reasons we just talked about. It's better to have more of a all in favor say aye and all opposed say nay. There's actually even a better way to do it, and I'll talk about it when we get right to the end, but it's probably something that is a little bit difficult to do in a system of government. But just a lot of the things here where, let's see, let me just go through these really quick. There's a whole raft of studies that talk about group influence, how people in a group are influenced by others in the group. And we've talked about some of those a little bit. But I put those lines, you guys have seen that little optical illusion, right? Which line is longer and which one's shorter? Actually, they're both exactly the same length, right? There was an interesting study that was done where it had people look at these and make the guess. 95% of the people got it right. They said the lines were the same length. They knew it. They figured it out. Then they kind of paired people up. And what they did is that they put people in there with somebody who was an actor, somebody who was part of the research group. And they would argue that the lines were not the same length. And they would say, no, these lines are not the same length. And then when they would ask the other individual, which line is longer, which is shorter, are they the same length? Now the people who got the right answer saying that they're the same length went from 95% down to 25%. They had been influenced by that other person. The interesting thing is that there was some other research done then where they actually did what's called an fMRI, where they actually did an MRI of brain waves, what activity centers were activated in a brain. And when people were doing these kinds of influence type of things, and the area of the brain that was activated that these fMRI things showed was in the cognitive area. What that meant is that it was activating the area where people were actually changing their perception. of what was right and wrong, or real and not real. So it's a powerful influence that can come from other people in a group. Again, group polarization is something that can happen. This is a deal where you have a group, everybody in the group pretty much agrees. Sometimes the things that you're being asked to take a look at are pretty straightforward. You say, yeah, okay, we agree. Everybody here seems to agree. So what do we do about it? And then what you start getting something that's called the severity shift. Now, this is a picture from long ago. I don't know how many of you remember the old quarterback in the NFL years ago, Michael. Like some of you remember, but he got into big trouble because he was running dog fighting. Where people would bet on dog fights, and they would run these dog fights where these dogs were. I mean, they were really getting chewed up pretty good. It was a pretty vicious kind of a thing. Well, he was charged with that and convicted, and eventually lost his ability to play in the NFL because of it. But what this picture tends to show is, what if his jury had been all dogs? How do you think he would have come out? That's because everybody would have thought the same way. How many of you are familiar with the lawsuits that you heard from several years ago, where like somebody went through a McDonald's drive-through, got a hot cup of coffee, they accidentally pour the hot coffee in their lap, they get burned, and they wind up getting $44 million in damages, compensatory compensation. Why? Yeah, okay, the person deserves some compensation for that, but $44 million? Does that really seem to be reasonable? This is what they call the severity shift. And it's interesting that you had some researchers that actually, before the jury members went in, who felt like a certain way on something, and then they would ask them before they went into the jury, they say, well, what do you think that the punishment should be? And they would say something. Then after these people went into the jury, and then the jury wound up convicting them or thinking that they were guilty of this, and then they were deciding on what the penalty should be, the penalty comes out way worse than what any one of them said before they went in. Why does that happen? It happens because when we have a tendency we're in a group, we kind of have a sense of where we are in that group, but we want to stay in that position in that group. It's kind of like when you're driving a pack of cars down the freeway, right? And you're in this position and you're going to stay in that position. Well, if the group suddenly starts going faster, you're going to go faster right along with them. Or if they slow down, you tend to slow down right along with them. It's kind of a group influence type of thing. And so what happens is, when you get into a meeting like that and somebody says, yeah, they're guilty, and their penalty ought to be this. And the next person says, I agree, I think they're guilty, and their penalty ought to be even worse. They ought to get a little more. And then the next one says, yeah, I agree, they're guilty too. And they really ought to be getting hammered on this. And by the time they're all done, they're way out here. I kind of liken this to seeing this with a landscaping plan for a use that I saw with the Planning Commission. And part of it was to review and approve the landscaping in the plan. And the group all agreed there should be landscaping and they should be planting some trees. And the first person said, yeah, I think, this would be great. We ought to have some shrubs and some bushes in this landscaping. And the next person said, well, yeah, I agree. And they ought to have some trees. They ought to put some trees in this too. And, small trees, but let's get the trees growing in there. And then the next person says, absolutely, they need trees, but you need to get that shade earlier. So they need to have bigger caliper trees. And by the time the Planning Commission was done, they were requiring them to plant half-grown redwood trees, because that's what it should have. It's a severity shift. It's something we need to be aware of. It's something that can affect how we make decisions. Well, so how do you avoid group influence like that? How do you depolarize group is really kind of the term for it. The most effective way to depolarize a group, to not get that groupthink and get that severity shift and all of the other things that go along with it, is to have at least a single person that thinks differently on the group. Again, there's that diversity thing. Have somebody in the group who's probably going to think a little differently. Um, I call it the 12 angry men effect. You know, one person can can turn the group and make things a little bit better. And most importantly, most of the studies show that non-polarized groups, non-uniform groups, tend to make better decisions and have better outcomes than groups that are all together. So, what does that tell us about having discussions in our meetings? Is it good? Is it not good? You know, it's a little bit of a mixed bag. Um, Discussions are good, particularly in an administrative action, if it brings out information, things that you didn't know, or things that people in the group didn't know, that are facts. You know, that there's this much traffic on the road. There's this happening on an adjacent lot. There are other things happening, things that you maybe didn't know, bringing out that information. That's good. For the policy types of issues, it may be a little bit more um, questionable, but maybe not bad. It's probably a good idea to hear what other people think. But how are you going to be swayed by that? And so here is an exercise that the authors of some of those books have recommended, and I have found seems to work pretty well. When you go into a meeting where you have an item, and then you're going to be asked to make a decision on it, a vote, right as you begin on that item, write down what you think you would vote for. Write it down right at the very beginning, and then keep it there. And then after you've gone through all of the stuff and you've had all of the discussion and everything else that's gone on, bring back out what you wrote right at the very beginning and take a look at it and say, well, this is what I thought initially. Did the discussion really change my mind on this? Maybe it did. And maybe for good reason. You know, think about, why did it change my mind? And think about that. At least you'll be not going along for these other more dubious social kinds of reasons, but more along the lines of, well, this is what I thought initially, but maybe I needed to change my mind because of this, because of that. So I find that to be a really good thing, a really beneficial thing. The last thing, again, is how we make our decisions. I talked about how to do your votes in a meeting. Really, the absolute best way is to have an anonymous vote. How do you do that? Well, one way you can do that is, rather than taking a verbal, you know, all those in favor say aye, or having everybody say what they're going to vote for, if they're in favor or not, have everybody write it down on a slip of paper. Are they in favor? Are they not in favor? And then collect those slips and have maybe the quorum secretary or whoever tally those up and then announce what the vote is. That is really the most direct and beneficial way to get a true reflection of how everybody would vote on their own, with their own thinking. Now, Utah State Code requires that whenever we have an action where there's a vote taken, that the vote of each member of the body is to be recorded. So we may not be able to do that. But I think you could still. I think what you could do is you could do the vote. You could have the tally made, and then the results announced, and everybody has their name on their slip, and then the secretary can just record in the minutes how each person voted based on that. If anybody in the audience wants to find out how you, commissioner, voted on this, they'll either come and ask you, or they'll go get the record afterwards and take a look. I haven't seen anybody brave enough to do that yet, to try and do that. But I think it could work. I think it would be allowable, something that you can do. So just a bunch of things to be aware of. It's not a perfect world we're living. Making decisions as a group, once you know all this stuff, it's easy, right? It's never easy, but it's something that we ought to be aware of, and something over the years that I kind of found fascinating and really found there were a lot of things that go into this that I think are beneficial for members of these small bodies to be aware of. And with that, I am done.